Hi, I'm Sharad Kutan and welcome to Let's Talk, the show that brings you the most important conversations in art, culture and ideas. Today I'm speaking to Ho Rui An. He's a Singaporean artist. We're here to see his show Look East, Gone West at the A+ Works of Art Gallery in Kuala Lumpur. Rui An, thank you so much for joining me. And I know we're going to have to keep this distance because of the new realities of Malaysia. But can I begin with asking you your own sort of self-description as an artist? You speak about working at the intersections of contemporary art, cinema, performance and theory. And just looking at your bio, you not only create works of art, but you write extensively as well. So could you help us understand why you describe yourself in this way, the question of intersection of all these different forms of labor, as it were?
I would generally describe my practice to be an essayistic practice. And for me, an essay can take different forms. It can take the form of a film essay, it can take the form of a written essay or a lecture. So these are all different forms in which I present my work. And I think for me it's quite exciting to be able to move between different sites in that, to put it as such. But generally I tend to work a lot in contemporary art, in exhibition making, but I also operate in theater, I make films, and I also write. So for me, like, different mediums offer different capacities for me to put forward the narratives that I want to tell.
Right. So in terms of, the kind of worldview that obviously underscores the work, you're saying that you're writing and performing or creating essays, as it were, visual essays. What kind of stories do you want to tell, and have they evolved over time? I mean, you look to me extraordinarily young, so I'm just wondering a little bit about, if you can tell us a bit about your formation, intellectual formation.
I was trained as an artist, but I've always been, I would say, less interested in images that circulate in the art world than images that circulate really within society, the broader society, popular images, images that can be extremely loaded with meaning, even though we do not give them the amount of attention as we would give a work of art in a gallery.
And why is that? Because you'd assume that if somebody said to you, going to art school, you're going to either make pretty pictures or very disturbing pictures. But,
right.
It tends to, at least popular perceptions of what artists want to do is to shock, enthrall, attract people through image making.
I guess for me, it was less about, I became less interested in so-called creating new images than looking at the amount of images that are already circulating in our everyday life, and to create a framework around understanding these images or giving them a second look. Because I do think that we live in a time, especially with social media, where we are surrounded by images. So as an artist, I tend to think, what does it mean for me to add another image into this swarm, as you can put it. Yeah. So for me, it was really more about developing a new understanding or new ways of approaching these images.
To what extent did that make you a kind of sociologist or anthropologist of visual culture as opposed to an artist?
I think there are definitely certain overlaps in the approach, and I did read anthropology for my master's, so it does have a bearing in terms of the way I look at things. But I do in a way, enjoy operating from the position of an artist, partly because I think it gives me, I guess, this latitude to move between different fields a bit more. I think you are a little less restricted in terms of disciplinary constraints.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if I understand correctly, artists have been working off images in popular culture. I think of the interventions of a kind of guerrilla girls, or those kinds of feminist critiques of images of women already out there in the world. There's a form of artistic expression. Who are your influences that help shape you and your practice?
I mean, certainly the genre of the essay film has been influential, but some of the most influential thinkers for me have actually been anthropologists, and anthropologists who read images. So someone like Rosamund Morris, who I studied with at Columbia, I do really appreciate the way that she sometimes looks at a very small detail in an image, and yet from that little detail expands such that it can tell us something about a particular society or even about an entire global system or the times in which we live. So in many ways, this mode of perception is something that I take quite a lot from the world of anthropology.
Right, so you're looking at particulars and maybe generalizing or seeing some depth in the particular image. It does seem that we are, as you call it, a swarm, which is not just a lot, but a moving, animate field of play in terms of images, right? So are there things that interest you in particular in an Asian context? And is it Asia and that segment of the visual play of images that interests you, or is it the entire world? I mean, do you have any limitations?
Really, no. I mean, we live in the internet world these days, so anywhere the internet reaches, you have access to those images. So I wouldn't say I restrict myself to particular geopolitical contexts.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
We're going to take a short break and we'll be back with more on Let's Talk. Hi, I'm Sharad Kudin and welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm speaking to Ho Rui An, he's a Singaporean artist, and we're at his show, Look East, Gone West, at the A+ Works of Art Gallery in Kuala Lumpur. Rayan, we were just talking about your own intellectual development. It's led to this particular work, which I find fascinating because it covers much of my formative years, as it were. In fact, I think my entire life is about, Asia and East Asia struggling for modernity and achieving it in some ways. Could you walk us through what you were doing in this exhibition, Look East, Gone West? We see all these images hung in text. What exactly are you telling us through them?
So the title of the exhibition, Look East, Gone West, is inspired by a quote by Margaret Thatcher from a speech that she gave when she visited Malaysia in 1985. And this was just after, a couple of years after Mahathir had announced the Buy British Last policy, followed by the Look East policy. And during that speech, Thatcher gave this very witty, but for me also slightly horrific remark. She said that, Prime Minister, you may sometimes look east and may travel east, but if you look far enough east and travel far enough east, you always come to the west. So there is this sense of, always returning to the same place, the sense that the east and the west might end up being the same location after all, despite all the dichotomies that are often drawn between the east and the west. So that is the title of the exhibition, and the exhibition shows two works, and this includes Asia the Unmiraculous, which is an installation that includes the documentation from a lecture, as well as these 14 illuminated LED frames with posters. And then the second work in the exhibition is called Student Bodies. It is a film that also pretty much comes from the same body of research. And this body of research really looks at that historical period that witnessed what we now know as the East Asian economic miracle.
Right, and I'm very interested in your own sense of trying to create a kind of critical distance from what is said. You quote Margaret Thatcher, Dr. Mahathir, the idea that somehow embedded in our dreams of autonomy, when I say we, I mean Asia, we in fact are or have to or compelled to mimic the West. Mm-hmm. The West is in fact what we seek to be, even as we try to distance ourselves from the West. What's your take on it? And especially located in Singapore, which is this hyper-modern space. I mean, if there was any space that was kind of Western in Asia, that would be it. So how do you find a critical relationship to these kinds of discourses?
I mean, growing up in the 90s, I mean, that was especially just before the Asian financial crisis, that was almost the height of the so-called Asian values discourse, wasn't it? And I think subsequently, the years later, that discourse starts to fade off a little bit when people really start to see that artificial divide between so-called Asian values and Western values was quite a comfortable dichotomy that was used by politicians on really both sides of the world to paper over or obscure, certain uncomfortable political realities. So whatever we call, what was called capitalism with Asian values, or the forms of what some have called state capitalism in this part of the world, although there were significant differences, the fundamental assumptions beneath it were largely similar. The motivations, that obsession with profit, for example, these were shared across both parts of the world.
I think what's interesting, and in one of these displays you have, in fact, on the table, writers like Kishore Mahbubani, who represents, in many ways, Singaporean intellectuals, maybe sponsored by the state or very close to state power, trying to articulate a Singaporean or Asian specificity when it comes to modernity, their relationship to liberal democracy. And there was a Singapore school, Daisy Chan Chi, Kishore Mahbubani, Lee Kuan Yew, articulating a route to modernity that did not have to be liberal and democratic in a European mode, right? So, what's your own sense of that, this kind of denial of, say, democracy and free speech and open society in favor of an Asian style, communal, model of modernity?
I think it becomes quite interesting when we look at how the discourse shifted during the financial crisis, for example. And on the one hand, of course, the critique from within Asia, from Singapore, from Malaysia, especially those who are criticizing the government's policies, is that Asian values became a kind of something that justified authoritarianism. But what was also interesting for me during looking at that period of time during the crisis was how international capital or the investor class in the West used the figure of the Asian authoritarian, the dictator, to justify the liberalization and mass privatization of these economies that entered into crisis. So one interesting contrast you can look at was actually between the depiction of Mahathir in that period and the depiction of Lee Kuan Yew. Both equally authoritarian leaders. But on the one hand, Lee Kuan Yew was, of course, still pushing forward with liberalization, still holding on to your neoliberal values in a way that defined the Thatcher-Reagan era. But on the other hand, of course, Mahathir during the crisis quite infamously stood up against the IMF and insisted on managing the economy his way, but that itself became conflated with his political authoritarianism. So I think that whole period had all kinds of unhelpful forms of conflation that really obscured, what were the real issues at stake, which was the fact that the people who were rendered most vulnerable, whether in the time of economic boom or in a time of crisis, were the workers, the workers who were exploited as the result of this relentless drive towards what we understood to be capitalist modernity.
Okay, so there's some fascinating images over there, Time for the Future with Dr. Mahathir on the cover of Time. But I tell you, I'm really fascinated. In fact, Dr. Mahathir appears in many of these images. I'm very interested in the ultimate coin test, China high-speed rail. I don't know why, but I'd like you to explain a little bit about that idea, especially because China has become so important in terms of our understanding of what an Asian-led modernity might look like.
So this particular frame, which is also an image that appears in the video on the screen, is based on quite a peculiar genre of videos that I noticed started appearing on YouTube, say around 2015, and that was of course the time when China launched this this Belt and Road Initiative, and there was this obsession with Chinese infrastructure. So in these videos, very often you see probably a foreign tourist or a traveler using one of China's many state-owned high-speed rail networks, and they would place a coin and have it standing on the ledge of the train window to test the stability of the high-speed train. So this was a very fascinating image for me because, of course, the train is a symbol of colonial modernity, but during the early periods, during the colonial times, during the time of economic development, what we most valorized about a train was its speed. But yet in this image, what was most valorized is the stability of the train. So I found that this was quite a compelling metaphor to think about the state of capitalism today, where we enter into a state where it is highly unstable, such that growth alone is not enough, and indeed can be quite scary when an economy develops too quickly. So in this sense, the so-called Chinese model, the Chinese capitalism, as some romanticize it as, is one that values stability at all costs. So, but the image that you see here is actually a 3D simulation I created. Usually on the videos you see on YouTube, the coin stands for, quite remarkably, some almost for an hour without toppling. But I created a simulation in which the coin never falls because it's an endless loop. So in a way, bring up this idea of a certain fantasy of a kind of superior capitalist model that would come and save us from a current dysfunctional capitalism.
Right, okay. Again, very fascinating ideas. Here you have a display of books, and I mentioned Kishore Mahbubani's book, Can Asians Think? There's a book here by The Voice of Asia with Mahathir Mohamad and Shintaro Ishihara. And we saw many of these collaborative works with other Asian intellectuals, so on and so forth. Herodotus, though, I was kind of amused by that. Why did you put him on this pile?
So actually Herodotus kind of begins the entire project, or begins the entire narrative, because I started by looking at the etymology of the word Asia. You know, what is the word Asia? Where did the word Asia come from? And of course, most sources would point towards ancient Greece. And in ancient Greece, the word Asia simply referred to what was east of Greece. So it didn't really have a defined parameter. It was just simply that whatever was beyond and in the direction of the east. So,
and the word Asia does begin in what might be called the Middle East today, right? West Asia is literally in the Middle East, and it sweeps all across to the Far East.
Yeah. So in that sense, even in that time, there were probably not a very strong conception of even China, given that it was so far away. So I wanted to begin there because this whole project is called Asia, the Unmiraculous. So I wanted to begin exactly with the signifier Asia. And to a certain extent, the project is about asking the question, what exactly is Asia?
Okay, wonderful. We'll take another short break and be back with Let's Talk. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharad Kuttan, with me Ho Rui An, Singaporean artist, and a man who put this show together, Look East Gone West, at the A+ Works of Art Gallery in Kuala Lumpur. It is curated by Kathleen Ditzig and supported by the National Arts Council in Singapore, also Epson and Ilham Gallery in Malaysia. So a lot of participants, collaborators in this. But let's talk a little bit about the future, Ryan, because at this point in time, you know, the pandemic has done so much to disrupt everything, including the world of art. And I wonder, you know, if you could say something about that, about what do you anticipate will be, you know, challenges for your practice. I mean, you're here in Kuala Lumpur, you use the green lane to get in, and it's all good. But if I remember, you know, art gallery openings, it's always packed with people, and there's a lot of unintended fluid exchange, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that all a thing of the past? How do we think about not just art making, but also the reception of art, its embeddedness in forms of social mingling and such?
I think definitely a lot has changed, and right now we are experiencing it. And personally, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty. I can't really answer exactly how, you know, things would look even a year from now.
Are you anxious at all?
Am I anxious? Yes and no. I mean, to an extent, as an artist, you know, or at least in terms of my own practice, a lot of it is, you know, I do it at home. You know, a lot of the research can still go on. The only thing that I regret is the ability to do research in another locality, because that has been quite a key part of my process. And that, I think, that is something that I do miss, because even in Singapore now, most of the shows that happen now are mostly with local artists, or many international shows have been cancelled. And I think that would be a big loss in terms of really, you know, art as a means of building international understanding, of understanding each other a little better.
Yeah, and you've been to Kochi in India, the Kochi Biennale or Biennial in Sharjah, and I'm just looking at your very impressive CV. That has become a kind of staple for the art world. It brings people and brings artists together, huge numbers of artists together to display their work and create conversations. Do you think it's just going to be, this pandemic will be a bump in the road that we'll come back to that? And do artists like yourselves rely on festivals like that for your own material sustenance?
I think things definitely have to change, and and I think even before the pandemic, there were really serious questions asked about the art world's addiction to travel, the art world's addiction to this kind of international production, which for all the good that it has done also comes with severe other consequences, whether it's ecological, whether it's in terms of, the sheer fatigue from overproducing. So I think all these are legitimate questions that have already been asked before the pandemic, but have only become more urgent with the pandemic. So I do hope that things would change. What I personally, for myself, when I travel to do work, to research, I often prefer staying for an extended duration. So I would generally not agree to just kind of parachuting into a place for a couple of days and then presenting a work and leaving, because I always think that being in a locality is always an opportunity to engage with that locality.
But your work's not site-specific, is it?
They're not site-specific in the sense that I don't make a sculpture that responds in a very physical manner to the location, but they are site-specific to the extent that I would often conduct field research in different places, and that research will come to inform the work itself. And of course, there really is no substitute for being physically in a location. Zoom conferences can only bring us so far in terms of really engaging and understanding a different context. So I think it would be a challenge, but I think it's something that we would and should learn to navigate, while at the same time, ensuring that as we do this, we are not, again, going back to that same old mode of just producing for the sake of producing. Instead, how does the work that is produced, how does this project speak to this locality or speak across different localities?
I wonder, though, that you speak about, the being there, especially with the exhibitions, and it's true of some art forms where, whether it's installation or a painting, where you might want to actually have no mediation between yourself and the work, because you sense scale, you sense textures, all those things that are lost when you're on a Zoom environment, right? But your work, it seems to me, perhaps more than others, would be very comfortable in that online space, just because we're not talking about textures anymore. We're just talking about images and text and ideas. It's very kind of, in many ways, conceptual. Would you agree to that? I mean, your work is the kind of thing that would work well online, in that online space?
In a certain way, yes. And for me, I'm not an artist who is confined to a particular medium. So I always enjoy the challenge of readapting a work for a different medium. But often, this is not as an easy a process as some imagine it to be. Sometimes it almost involves creating a new work altogether, because a different medium has a different mode of attention, a different way that we experience the artwork. So I'm not opposed to bring things online, but as having the privilege of coming to KL to install this exhibition, I also start to kind of regain the sense of what it means to install a work in space. And in a certain way, this is a spatial experience still, the placement of objects, how we move in a space in relation to these objects is a key part of the exhibition experience. And I think that is, I don't know if it might be replicated in the future in the online world through VR or whatever, but certainly that is something that you can't quite create in online space right now.
Right, VR, very interesting. Your next project, Ryan?
Currently, so this project is actually still traveling into next year. So I'm working on kind of future editions of this project. I'm also doing more research that's really extending from this body of work around the Asian miracle. And this new body of research really looks more at China's economic development and the relationship between Singapore and China during the period of China's economic boom.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Rui An, for
Thank
being on
you.
the show. So I've been speaking to Ho Rui An. He's a Singaporean artist, and this is his show, Look East, Gone West, I believe at the A+ Works of Art Gallery. It's collaborating on the platform, CIMB's platform, Arttober, I believe it's called, and it will be presenting, I guess, many art exhibitions during this period. So you can catch this festival, I think, by contacting the gallery, getting a viewing, or allowing you to come. So social distancing, SOPs will remain intact for the time being. That's all we have for Let's Talk. I'm Sharad Kutan, only on Astro AWANI.